At the edge of a sleepy village in northern Vietnam, where the river flows slow and brown and banana trees whisper in the afternoon breeze, there stood a small wooden shed, simple, weathered, and always open. Inside, an old man named Hoa carved in silence. He was not famous. There were no signs, no apprentices, just the sound of chisel on wood and the faint scent of incense drifting in from a nearby temple. But everyone in the village knew Hoa, not because they saw him often, but because when someone passed away, it was Hoa they went to. He didn't build furniture, didn't carve statues for temples or markets. He only made one thing: coffins. Not the shiny lacquered kind you see in city funeral homes, but warm, solid, handcrafted pieces of farewell. Coffins that carried more than just bodies. They carried stories. Hoa never rushed, never haggled over price. He'd sit quietly with the grieving family, asking only a few gentle questions. What did she love? What kind of flower did he plant? Then he would return to his bench and begin. Sometimes he carved a songbird near the handle, a sunburst behind the name, or a mother's hands folded in prayer. No two were alike, and perhaps that's why people from other villages started coming too. Even the monks, who rarely left their pagodas, would nod toward his shed and say, "His wood remembers." Hoa never seemed to age. His hair turned silver, then white, but his hands stayed steady, patient, precise. And in a world that rushed to forget, he quietly carved remembrance into every grain. If this kind of craftsmanship, this kind of soul in wood, speaks to you, please consider subscribing to Woodcarving Artist. Because not all stories are told with words. Some are told with cedar, jackfruit, and the soft hush of a blade meeting grief. In the evenings, children would pass by his shop on their way home, sometimes stopping just to watch the shavings fall like golden snow. They didn't understand what he did, but they felt the peace in it, and that was enough. The river flowed, the trees swayed, and the man who carved for the dead helped the living hold on. Every coffin Hoa made began not with wood, but with listening. Long before the first chisel met the plank, he would sit cross-legged on the cool floor of his shed, across from a grieving son, a tearful wife, or a child too young to understand why Daddy wasn't coming home. He rarely spoke. He just nodded, his hands folded gently in his lap, letting the silence do the work. People would come in thinking they needed a coffin, but what they really needed was someone who wouldn't rush them, wouldn't quote a price, wouldn't ask how soon it had to be done. Hoa gave them space, and when the words came, sometimes in a slow trickle, sometimes in a storm, he received every detail like it mattered. She loved magnolia flowers. He always whistled when he cooked rice. He used to sing lullabies to the dog, even after her children moved out. Hoa remembered it all, and then, slowly, he began. Each stroke of the chisel was a translation. Grief into grace, memory into wood grain. A vine curling around the corner for a gardener. A carved bell for a retired teacher. Tiny dancing fish for a boy who had once dreamt of the sea. His workshop became something sacred. Not a place of death, but of closure, of beauty born from loss. Those who saw his work knew this was no ordinary craftsman. This was someone who carved emotion with the same care most carve wood. If stories like this move you, if you believe that art can be a vessel for healing, please subscribe to Woodcarving Artist. We bring these human moments to light, one quiet carving at a time. Sometimes people came back after the funeral, not to thank him, but to sit again in that same spot, as if his shed had held their sorrow so gently that it now held something of their loved one too. Hoa never asked why. He simply nodded and went on carving. Because to him, each piece wasn't finished when the lid was closed, but when the heart was a little lighter. And in that quiet village by the river, he became not just a coffin maker, but a keeper of stories. People in the village often whispered that old Hoa had no family, no wife, no children, no photographs on the wall, no letters by the windowsill, just stacks of seasoned wood leaning against the back wall of his shed, and the same small kettle he used to boil tea every afternoon. But no one dared ask, not out of fear, but out of respect. He was kind, always nodded politely, even helped fix the fence at the school one year when the bamboo rotted. Yet he never joined festivals, never stayed at the temple long after a funeral. He would leave quietly, his sandals brushing the path, his hands folded behind his back. And so the village filled in the blanks. He must have lost someone, they'd say. Maybe in the war, maybe in the flood. But the truth was, no one knew. And Hoa never told. All they knew was that when a child died, Hoa carved gentler. When a mother passed, he shaped the wood as if wrapping a shawl around her one last time. And when a father's body came home after years away, Hoa worked through the night, his eyes damp but his hands steady. The irony was never lost. The man who helped others say goodbye had no one left to say hello. But perhaps that's why he gave so much to his craft. Perhaps every curve of the wood, every polished corner, every prayer he muttered beneath his breath was for the family he once had, or still missed. If this quiet kind of devotion stirs something in your heart, if you believe in honoring those who work in silence, with purpose, with love, please subscribe to Woodcarving Artist. These stories matter. These souls deserve to be remembered. In the evenings, Hoa would sit outside his shed, sipping bitter tea, eyes watching the river reflect the last light. Sometimes a bird would land on the roof. Sometimes a child would wave. He never waved back, but he smiled. Because maybe, deep down, he knew the work he did, the care he carved into every goodbye, was the closest thing to family he had left. And maybe that was enough. It was late in the rainy season when the boy drowned. His name was Toon. He was just 7. The river had risen fast that day, swallowing the edges of the rice fields, turning narrow paths into streams. No one saw him slip. No one heard his cry. By the time they pulled his body from the current, his mother had already collapsed to the ground, clutching his sandals to her chest. That night, the family came to Hoa's shed, broken, hollow, unable to speak. But they didn't need to. Hoa looked into the father's eyes, then slowly poured 3 cups of tea, letting the silence stretch long and deep like the river itself. He took the smallest piece of golden jackfruit wood he had left and placed it gently on the bench. It was smooth, light, soft enough for his knife to glide, but strong enough to hold a child's last sleep. For 2 days and nights, Hoa carved without pause. He shaped the wood like a cradle, not a coffin. He etched tiny stars across the lid, 40 of them, just like the ones Tom used to count at night from his window. He carved birds in flight at the base, their wings open wide, soaring not away, but home. And on the inside, beneath the boy's name, he gently inlaid a tiny boat. Just enough space for a soul to cross gently, safely, into light. When the family returned, they wept, not because the pain vanished, but because someone had understood it and held it in wood. They didn't speak, they just bowed. And Hoa, for the first time in many years, placed his hand over his heart and bowed back. If this story moved you, if you believe craftsmanship can be prayer, and that art can carry grief more tenderly than words, please subscribe to Woodcarving Artist. There are still hands in this world that carve not for fame, but for peace. That night, after the funeral, Hoa sat alone by the river, holding a single shaving of jackfruit wood between his fingers. He didn't cry, but his eyes were full. Because for a moment, he remembered what love felt like. And in the quiet hum of crickets and soft lapping water, he whispered the boy's name, as if to carry it just a little further downstream. At first, people didn't speak much about Hoa. He was just the man who made coffins. But after Tuum's funeral, something shifted. Word began to spread, not in loud conversations, but in the soft way neighbors talk when the rice is being milled or when someone passes by the temple gate. "Did you see what he carved?" one whispered. It wasn't just a box. It looked like it was made from love. Others, curious, began to stop by the shed, not to order a coffin, but to watch. Children sat on the stone steps outside, eyes wide as they saw sunlight catch the curve of a chisel. The elderly, who once muttered, "It's just his job," began to sit in silence, watching him sand the lid of a new piece as if it were a newborn's bath. Even the monks came. One brought a small bell, asking if Hoa would carve a frame for it. "Not for sale," the monk smiled, "just for remembrance." And Hoa did. He carved a single lotus petal, open, ready to receive the sound. From that day on, the villagers saw his work differently. No longer just functional, no longer something to bury and forget. They began to speak of him as the man who helps us say goodbye with dignity. Some even came to ask for carvings in advance, not out of fear, but out of peace. A woman once said, "If my last bed is made by him, I can rest easy." If you believe that true craftsmanship can change how we see life and death, then you'll feel at home here. Subscribe to Woodcarving Artist, where each story reminds us that even in endings, there is beauty. Even in sorrow, there is art. Slowly, the community began to offer help. A younger man brought wood from the mountains. A widow brought warm meals. They never stayed long. No one tried to befriend him. But they honored him, and that was enough. In a world moving faster every day, one small riverside village had found something rare. A quiet man who carved not for money, but for meaning. And little by little, they began to protect him, like a treasure that only the river could understand. One winter morning, when the air hung thick with fog and the river barely stirred, Hoa opened his shed and chose a piece of wood unlike any he'd touched before. It was rosewood, dark, heavy, rich with scent. A rare plank he had tucked away for nearly 2 decades, wrapped in old cloth, hidden beneath bamboo mats. No one had ever seen it. No one knew why he kept it. Until that morning. He laid it gently across the bench, ran his fingers along its grain, and whispered something too soft to hear. And then, without a single word to the world, he began to carve. Day by day, the piece took shape. But this time, no family came. No funeral was planned. There were no weeping mothers or quiet sons. This coffin was not for sale. He worked in silence. He carved the corners with waves, gentle, rolling like the river outside. He carved a small open door on the side panel, and above it, a bird in mid-flight. On the lid, instead of a name, he carved a tree. Tall, full of leaves, its roots curling deep into the bottom edge. It was the most intricate work he had ever done. And when villagers came by, curious, he simply smiled and said, "It's practice." But they knew this was for him. The man who had sent so many to rest was quietly preparing for his own, and he was doing it the only way he knew how, with reverence, with care, with art. If this story touched something deep in you, if it reminded you of the quiet preparations we all make, then we invite you to subscribe to Woodcarving Artist. Because some stories aren't told loudly. Some are carved slowly, in the hope that someone, someday, will understand. When the piece was finished, he didn't put it away. He didn't hide it. He left it in the corner of his shed, covered in a simple white cloth. Not as a symbol of fear, but of peace. Because when you've spent a lifetime honoring others in their final rest, you learn not to fear your own. And so, the man who carved for everyone else finally carved something just for himself. The winter that followed was colder than most. The river mist clung longer to the trees, and the air grew thin by dawn. Hoa moved slower, his breath more labored, but his hands still steady. He stopped accepting new work. When villagers asked, he only smiled and said, "The wood needs to rest." But one morning, he opened the shed and took out a final block of sandalwood, soft, fragrant, warm to the touch. Not for a coffin, not for anyone else. This time, he carved something small, delicate, a wooden figure, not of Buddha, not of a saint, but of a young child with closed eyes, holding a flower in its lap. Day after day, he shaped the features, soft cheeks, folded hands, a gentle curl of a smile. And when it was finished, he placed it beside the tree he had carved into his own coffin. No one ever asked what it meant, but those who saw it felt something in their chest, like the ache of a memory they couldn't name. That same week, he swept the shed floor clean, oiled his tools, and tucked them away in silence. That night, the village heard the bell at the temple ring once. Slow, deep, final. By morning, Hoa was gone. They found him seated at the door of his shed, wrapped in his old coat, the figure of the child resting in his hands. No tears, no struggle, just peace. As if he had simply followed the river and walked home. If you've followed his story this far, then you already understand. This was never just about wood. It was about legacy, about love carved quietly into the world. If stories like this remind you to slow down, to feel, to remember, please subscribe to Woodcarving Artist. We honor lives like Hoa's, silent, powerful, unforgettable. The village buried him in the coffin he carved for himself, and above his grave, they planted a tree, not for shade, but for memory. Its roots sank deep, its leaves caught the wind, and every year when the river rises and the sky softens, a child would place flowers by that tree and whisper, "Thank you, Ong Hoa." We tell stories not just to remember, but to feel, to touch the invisible thread that connects one soul to another, across time, across silence, across the space between what is carved and what is left behind. Hoa never sought attention. He never signed his work or asked for recognition. But through each coffin, each carving, each grain of wood he shaped with quiet reverence, he left behind a language more powerful than words, a language of care, of dignity, of farewell without fear. And maybe that's why this story matters. Because in a world that often forgets the quiet ones, it's the quiet ones who carry us through the hardest moments, the final ones, the ones that truly define what it means to be human. If Hoa's story moved you, if you saw not just a craftsman, but a guardian of memory, we invite you to subscribe to Woodcarving Artist, not just for the sake of a channel, but to keep these stories alive, to remind the world that there is still grace in simplicity, Still art in farewell. Still beauty in the hands that shape the last thing we will ever rest in. Every culture has its artists, but only some carve not to display, but to comfort. Not to impress, but to bless. Through this story, we hope you felt that blessing too. That sense of peace, of grounding, of stillness. Maybe you thought of someone you lost. Maybe you saw your own life reflected in the quiet of Hoa's eyes. Or maybe you simply paused in a world that rushes and listened. And if you did, thank you. These moments are what give meaning to what we create. Before we go, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us what part of Hoa's journey touched you the most. And if you know someone who would appreciate this story, share it with them. Because sometimes, one story is enough to change the way we see the world. This is Woodcarving Artist, where every carving tells a deeper story. And every story carves its place in our hearts.